The morning my son left, the sky was unusually clear, as if the world had decided to look beautiful on a day meant to break me. He stood near the door, adjusting his watch, avoiding my eyes. I handed him the envelope with my pension money, my fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said he would return soon. The door closed softly, but something inside me cracked loudly. By evening, the truth revealed itself in quiet ways: an empty wallet, a fridge with only a stale lemon, cupboards echoing when opened. Hunger arrived slowly, not as pain, but as humiliation. I sat alone, realizing that I had trusted someone who saw my survival as optional. That night stretched endlessly. Every sound in the house felt louder: the ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, my own breathing. I remembered years of choosing my son over myself, skipping meals so he could eat better, wearing the same saris while buying him new clothes. I told myself this was what love looked like. But as my stomach growled in the darkness, a frightening thought surfaced: love should not feel like abandonment. Somewhere between fear and exhaustion, I understood that waiting for him to care could cost me my dignity and possibly my life. The next day, I boiled rice with just salt and water. I ate slowly, pretending it was enough. Outside, the world continued normally. Children laughed, vendors shouted, life moved on. Inside, I felt invisible. I checked my phone and saw pictures my son had posted online: blue water, bright smiles, expensive drinks. He looked happy. I looked at my empty bowl and finally allowed myself to ask the question I had avoided for years: who was taking care of me? In the afternoon, I stood before the old wooden cupboard I had protected like a shrine. Inside were items I had saved not for myself, but for a future I was no longer guaranteed to reach. My wedding bangles. A silver tray from my mother. A ring my husband once held while promising we would grow old together. My hands trembled as I touched them, but not from regret, from resolve. I wrapped them carefully and walked out of the house, my steps slow but determined, as if I were finally walking toward myself. The shopkeeper didn't rush me. He saw my age, my hands, my eyes. When he counted the money and placed it before me, I felt something unfamiliar: control. With that money, I bought food I had denied myself for years. Fresh vegetables, fruits that smelled like sunshine, milk, bread still warm from the oven. When I returned home, I filled the refrigerator shelf by shelf. It wasn't luxury, it was respect. I cooked a proper meal and ate without guilt. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without fear of tomorrow. When my son returned 3 days later, he walked in confidently, already complaining about hunger. He opened the fridge and froze. His voice shook as he asked where the money came from. I told him calmly that I sold what was mine. His face changed from confusion to anger to panic. He accused me of destroying his future, of being selfish, of losing my mind. I listened quietly, because for once, his words had no power over me. I showed him the documents he never expected to see. The house, my house, was legally mine alone. His name had been removed months earlier when I noticed how often he spoke about inheritance instead of responsibility. His voice broke. He threatened to leave forever. I nodded. "That is your choice," I said, just like it was mine to survive. He packed in silence this time. The door closed again, but this time, it felt final and freeing. The house changed after that. It felt lighter. I rearranged furniture, opened windows, let sunlight touch corners that had been dark for years. I cooked when I wanted, rested when I needed, and stopped apologizing for existing. I realized that love without boundaries becomes permission for cruelty, and sacrifice without limits becomes self-erasure. Now, when I open the refrigerator, I don't just see food. I see proof that I chose myself. I drink tea by the window in the mornings, watching life pass without fear. My son calls sometimes, unsure, distant. I answer politely but firmly. I no longer negotiate my worth. Growing old does not mean growing silent. It means finally hearing your own voice clearly. This story is not about revenge. It is about survival. About understanding that parents are not meant to starve so their children can vacation. Love should never require self-destruction. And sometimes, The bravest thing an old heart can do is say enough. Days passed, and something unexpected happened. Peace became routine. I woke up without anxiety, without the fear of checking my wallet or counting groceries. I started taking morning walks again, something I had stopped years ago because my knees hurt and my spirit felt heavier than my body. The neighbors noticed the change. They said my face looked brighter, my voice steadier. What they didn't know was that for the first time in decades, I was living without waiting for permission. One afternoon, I found an old photo album while cleaning. Pictures of my younger self stared back at me, a woman who laughed easily, who dreamed without guilt, who believed her life mattered. I sat on the floor for a long time, turning pages slowly, grieving not my son's absence, but the years I had disappeared while trying to be a perfect mother. That grief was painful, but it was also honest. And honesty, I learned, is healing. My son called again one evening. His voice was softer this time, unsure, almost respectful. He asked how I was doing. I told him the truth. I was fine. Better than fine. There was silence on the other end, followed by a quiet apology that felt more like relief than regret. I accepted it, not because it erased the past, but because holding anger would only chain me to it. Forgiveness did not mean surrender. It meant freedom on my own terms. That night, I cooked dinner just for myself and ate slowly, savoring each bite. I realized something powerful then. Independence is not loneliness when it is chosen. The house no longer felt empty, it felt complete. I had everything I needed because I had finally learned the most difficult lesson of all, that my life had value even when I stopped giving everything away. Time has a strange way of softening pain without erasing memory. Weeks passed, and my days began to develop a gentle rhythm. I woke early, opened the windows, and let sunlight spill into rooms that once felt heavy with unspoken expectations. I started writing again in a small notebook, nothing important, just thoughts, memories, little truths I had swallowed for years. Writing helped me understand that silence had been my longest habit, and breaking it felt like learning a new language at this age. One morning, I visited the temple alone. Not to ask for forgiveness or favors, but to offer gratitude. I thanked life for the strength it had forced me to discover when I was at my weakest. Sitting there quietly, I realized that survival had taught me more than comfort ever did. I had learned how easily love can turn into control when fear replaces respect, and how necessary it is to protect your own spirit, no matter how old you are. When I returned home, I found a letter slipped under the door. It was from my son. The words were clumsy, uneven, and clearly written in haste. He admitted that life without support was harder than he imagined, that responsibility felt heavier when no one rescued him. I read the letter slowly, without anger. His struggle was no longer my burden to carry. Loving him now meant allowing him to stand on his own, even if he stumbled. That evening, I placed the letter back into its envelope and set it aside. I did not rush to reply. For the first time, I understood that I did not owe immediate answers to anyone. I cooked dinner, watered the plants, and sat quietly as night settled in. There was a deep calm in knowing that my life was finally centered around peace, not obligation. And in that calm, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: trust in myself. As the seasons began to change, I noticed how differently I now experience time. Earlier, days felt like a burden I had to endure, but now they unfolded gently, without pressure. I started taking care of my health in small ways, stretching in the mornings, eating on time, resting when my body asked for it. These were simple acts, yet they felt revolutionary. For years, I had treated my own needs as inconveniences. Now, they became priorities, and that shift changed everything. One afternoon, a neighbor came by with her young daughter. The child watched me closely as I brewed tea, curious and quiet. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly, without any reason. That hug stayed with me long after they left. It reminded me that kindness does not have to be earned through sacrifice. Sometimes it is given freely, simply because someone sees you. In that moment, I realized how invisible I had allowed myself to become, and how visible I was learning to be again. My son called a few days later. His voice sounded tired, stripped of confidence. He spoke about work, about bills, about how difficult independence felt. I listened without interrupting, without offering solutions. When he paused, waiting for advice or rescue, I told him gently that he would figure it out. The silence that followed was heavy but necessary. Growth often begins in discomfort, and I refused to take that away from him again. That night, as I prepared my bed, I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. Not pride in winning or proving anything, but pride in restraint. I had learned that love can exist without control, that support does not mean surrender. As I turned off the lights, I understood that this chapter of my life was not about rebuilding relationships. It was about rebuilding myself, piece by piece, with patience and grace. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, I realized that my home no longer felt like a place of waiting. Earlier, every sound at the door carried hope or fear, a hope that someone would return, fear that they would need something from me. Now, the rain was just rain, and the silence was simply rest. I made myself a cup of tea and sat comfortably, listening to the steady rhythm outside, feeling grounded in the present rather than trapped in the past. I began to notice how many choices I had reclaimed without even realizing it. Choosing when to sleep, what to eat, how to spend my afternoons. These decisions may seem small, but after years of living for someone else, they felt enormous. I understood then that freedom does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes, it settles quietly into daily life, until one day you look around and realize you are no longer shrinking to fit into someone else's expectations. My son sent a message later that week. Not a request, not a complaint, just a simple update about his life. I read it without anxiety, without the urge to fix or advise. I replied kindly, briefly, honestly. That balance felt right. For the first time, our connection existed without dependency. It was fragile, but it was real. Before sleeping that night, I stood in the doorway of my room and looked at the house with new eyes. Every wall, every corner held memories, some painful, some tender. But none of them controlled me anymore. I whispered a quiet promise to myself. I would never again trade my well-being for approval. And as I turned off the light, I knew that this promise was the truest form of love I had ever given. The last lesson arrived quietly, without drama. One morning, while watering the plants near the window, I caught my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back looked older, yes, but also calmer, steadier. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, no silent apology for existing. In that moment, I understood that healing is not about returning to who you were before the pain. It is about becoming someone who refuses to abandon herself again. I began sharing my story with a few people who crossed my path, not as a complaint, but as a reminder. Some listened in silence, some with tears. Many said they saw their own lives reflected in mine. That is when I realized my experience had meaning beyond my home. Survival, when spoken aloud, becomes guidance. And dignity, once reclaimed, becomes contagious. My son and I now speak occasionally, with clear boundaries and honest distance. There is respect where entitlement once lived. I no longer measure love by how much I give, but by how safe I feel being myself. The future is uncertain, but it is no longer frightening. I have learned to trust my strength, earned through pain and protected by wisdom. As the days move forward, I live simply. I eat well, rest often, and wake each morning with gratitude instead of dread. The house is quiet, but my heart is not empty. It is full of lessons, of peace, of self-respect. And if there is one truth I would leave behind, it is this: no matter how late it feels, it is never too late to choose yourself.